ora, and welcome to the Marlborough Book Festival podcast, the place where you can hear writers talk about their work, their lives, and the inspiration behind their writing. I'm Sonia, the chair of the committee. This year's festival was a fantastic weekend, and we are eager to share the recordings with you very soon. In the meantime, enjoy this engaging session from the 2023 Book Festival.
So William, who comes from Nelson, travelled over this morning, has a BA in History, Economics and Politics, and a Master's in War Studies from King's College in London. And William, I didn't know War Studies was a thing that existed.
Good morning, everybody. It is something, it used to be a very small niche. It's growing, and it's the study of war as a social phenomenon. So it's without morals or whether we accept that war is right or wrong. It's the idea that war exists, and you could look at it across the course, up and down, causes, the practice, ancient, and it was just it was a really interesting course. I was living in London at the time, and I really enjoyed it, and it pushed me off to do different things from what I'd been doing before.
What on earth made you want to do it?
I'm a war nerd. I grew up. I'm an army brat. So my father spent 25 years in the army. So I grew up with war stories, and but had always been interested. It's such a large part of war. Is such a large part of our cultural understanding, be it in movies or as we discuss songs, books, and so I'd done my undergrad and things like international relations and interesting things like that, but really narrowed it down just to this kind of the experience of war and the cultural phenomenon of war I was really interested in.
So you're actually a war analyst, is that correct?
I really struggled to define things, but I was a defence analyst for a while. I worked in the defence industry for a while.
So Russia, Ukraine.
Yep.
Basically, what do you, with your expertise behind you?
I have to a certain extent given up following news. The news I get is from comedic podcasts, usually the Bugle. I think the comedians do as good a job of analysing what's going on these days as anybody else. But morale is such a large part of how any army across time will fight, and the Russian soldiers have no interest in being there, and the Ukrainian soldiers or the Ukrainian people fighting have a very invested in the fight. So I think if you look at the way Afghanistan played out, if you look at the way Iraq played out, over time the large invader struggles to justify their losses, both in terms of blood and treasure. And so,
were you surprised when Russia moved into Ukraine in February last year?
No, I think the way that the NATO alliance has continued to expand eastward has always made Russia very nervous. If you go back, take the geography of Europe into account, there is a great wide passage that runs sort of east to west, west to east, and armies have always travelled it, be it
Napoleon or Hitler.
Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin, the Mongols, the Austro-Hungarians, they all go on this one way, and there's no natural barriers between that get in the way of that. So the Russians have always, since the Second World War, tried to push that boundary of where they have to start retreating from, further and further west, and the Ukraine has been part of that. There's an amazing book by Timothy Snyder called Bloodlands, which is one of the more disturbing things I've ever read, and it still sits very close to the surface for me, and it charts the Ukraine between 1918 and 1950, and in that period you have the collectivization of Stalinist Russia and the farms, you have the Nazi invasion, and then you have the Russians going the other way, and it is the most disturbing, tormented series of human experiences. And I think we forget, because we are so far away and live on an island, what it must be to live without borders, in the sense that Ukraine has no natural barriers to anyone entering. It could be Belarus. Poland is exactly the same way. And to live in somewhere where you, at any time, one of your larger neighbours could come sweeping through on a whim, as this case, must be it's a very alien experience for us as New Zealanders, because we're so far away.
We actually have a Russian daughter-in-law, and we find that quite an awkward situation. That, everybody says to us, so how are her family doing? And, what does she think about it? And we say, well, we don't talk about it. It's just not discussed at all.
No, and
that's in respect to her, because she doesn't want to.
No, but if you, the Ukrainian, as I said, the experience over the last 100 years has been horrific. But so have the experience of the average Russian ever since. And it's just a way that their community or their country is growing.
Well, this book was written while you were actually over in London. It took 5 years to write. Now, I'm a slow reader or writer, but 5 years seems an awfully long time. It is a big book, I will admit.
I started that one. We were living in the UAE. This one I started in London. That one, yes, and I finished it when we were living here. I would write. I have 3 children, and my wife works. So I used to have a very small window where I could write. So I'd write between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. And we were living then in Nelson in a house without insulation. And it was so cold in the mornings. I'd be typing and I'd be wrapped up. And then I'd do 2 hours of writing, and then I'd take the dog for a walk on the beach, and I would then process what I'd written, or come up with some new ideas, or rush back and change some sentences or paragraphs. So it is 155,000 words. I can't genuinely believe anyone actually gets to the end of it. It's so long.
Well, I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Although it's not actually, I don't think you can say you enjoy a subject like this, but the basis of it is, but it's based on Son White, whose real name was Andrew, I think.
Yeah.
He was named Son because he had 4 sisters in front of him, or 5 sisters, I think it is. He was a Southland farmer, and he, like so many from around the world, went off and signed up to go to World War I, and he wanted to take his horse because he wanted to be in the cavalry. He didn't have his own horse. He had to go and ask the farmer he was working for if he could take the horse Ben that he had trained, and then the army had to pay £20 for Ben. And then he got on a ship and sailed off to Egypt, thought he was going to run down the Hun and have this wonderful, wonderful time. Well, it didn't turn out like that at all, did it?
No. So a friend of mine, Owen Eastwood, who I made friends with, he had read this book, and he is a Southland, very proud Southlander, lives in the UK now, and he introduced me to the story of Son. So he said there's this amazing story of this man, and had done research and sort of he wanted actually, and he's probably right, that he thinks Son's story should be a film. I can't write films. I don't know where to start, but so I ended up writing a book. But
has anyone shown interest in turning it into a film yet?
I'm still surprised people are reading it, let alone buying the rights to the film. And there's bare bones of what Son's story is. So
this is historical fiction, but there's fact behind it.
There is. So I used his war record, so I know exactly where he was when. But bits and pieces I had to fill in. So the horse Ben is a made up, that he had to ask the farmer for it. But Son had to leave school at 13, and was a farm labourer. And so, like many, I think, that First World War, we see the kind of idea of them fighting for king and country, but before the First World War, many of them would never go, be it in the UK or New Zealand, would never leave more than 4 miles from their home or their farm or their town. So it wasn't just the idea. I don't think many people signed up for king and country as much as they did. This is my one chance to get out of here, to get a chance, because the lives weren't particularly interesting. relatively monotonous, and everyone was off. This was in the story, I portray Son like that he's off to have a bit of fun. And they did. They thought it was going to be over by Christmas. They hadn't reckoned, and I try and play with it in the book, that in the lead up to the First World War, all my metaphors, and it's all about afternoon and dusk, because this is the end of, for me, the New Zealand colonial period. This is the end of a agricultural focus, and these boys that go over run into an industrialized world for the first time, and Son and Ben are certainly involved in this kind of idea that we sent over a lot of cavalry, or light cavalry, the Otago Rifles, the Australians sent the Australian Light Horse, and there really wasn't a place for them. They had prepared, they were absolutely brilliant soldiers at what they had been prepared to do, but there was no place for them on the battlefield anymore. The artillery, modern artillery up against a man on a horse, there's a lot of soft in the man on the horse, and the artillery just, there was no place. I
was actually gobsmacked at the point that they got on the ship and they left New Zealand and arrived in Egypt. Everybody knew that they were coming, but there was not even a tent set up for them. They had to turn around and set up their own campsite. Nobody was looking after them.
We talk about the military in terms of ship shape and everything organised, but it's often not. And also the number of people involved for the amount of resources, and they did get transferred to Egypt very late because suddenly the canal was in play. The Turks had decided that it was a good opportunity, and so that's why they ended up in Egypt, because the Turks had, I think they were, and then there was a Sensusi, like an uprising against the British rule. So the Suez Canal, which is such a major important, and so they were on way and they got transferred across. So they weren't expected to be there. They weren't planned to be there. They just ended up there.
We all know that Gallipoli was a horrific event, the battle for Gallipoli, and it's very vivid within the book. You actually went there and you said that was a very important part of your research for the book.
Yeah, I did. We were living in the Middle East, so it was easier for me to go. I went in the middle of winter, so there was no crowds. It wasn't during Anzac Day. And I asked Christopher Pugsley, a military historian, for which guide, and I had this guide, and he and I just tootled around, and they talk about it, proper military historians, I'm not one, talk about walking the battlefield and understanding the concept of what the geography is. Because in a book or a history book or a personal account, it's very hard to see what they're seeing, but when you stand there, and they're very sharp cliffs. I had never really realised it's an incredibly New Zealand landscape, but at the same time, a stupid place to try and fight a battle.
We were on a loss to nothing, weren't we?
Yeah, but you are in the First World War. Everybody was really on a loss to nothing. It wasn't only those on the defence. If you were trying to attack, and it is in most war, if you're trying to attack, you're going to take large losses.
That happened when the New Zealanders moved into France. Same thing.
Yeah,
the Germans were on the height, looking down.
Yeah, and they dug in, and they were they had great trenches. But it was on the British and the French, but in First World War, wanted this attacking spirit, wanted to foster in their men this idea of attack, and they did. But they again ran into modern developments like barbed wire or the machine gun or the artillery, and suddenly the tactics had to evolve, and they did evolve through the war. You got to things like the creeping barrage, which was right up in front of people, and you were able to do certain things. The tank came along later on, but for those initial periods, that as the tactics evolved, there were horrific losses.
One of the things I found fascinating there was that all the machinery that was being developed, like the bombs being fired. And the big thing there was that they were landing into mud, so they actually weren't going off. They weren't designed to land in soft.
Yeah, and the winters that they had during the First World War were really very. There were bad winters, a lot of rain, a lot of storms, and interestingly, in the Second World War, you had the same thing, and but that's the evolution, and the fields of the Low Countries are were very complex. I imagine they are now very complex because they're below sea level, and they developed amazing. The farmers over centuries have devised drainage, but if you come along with millions of men and millions of artillery shells and horses, you just end up destroying these drainage systems, and so the land reverts to being what it was before you put the drain in bogs, and that's that mud they talk about, and you see, and people will drown in shell holes that were slurry basically, and
more people died of dysentery than of gunshot wounds.
Always, artillery was the biggest killer in the First World War, but people always, in terms of warfare, it's sickness that gets them. In the ancient times, it was always a plague would take out a camp, or you'd get an illness that would run through these people. And you've got to remember that also we didn't have as many. If you look at Spanish flu, which occurs at the end of the First World War, people didn't move as much as we do now, and we saw over COVID how quickly you can move a viral infection due to aeroplanes and the way we live now in terms of travel. But they didn't move around as much then. So you built up probably a local immunity to what the types of infections that you might get, but suddenly you're then shoved together with everybody from New Zealand on a ship, and then you end up somewhere like Egypt, and suddenly you're just running into all these different pathogens. So yeah, it's an incredible way to get ill.
Is it fair to say that the English used the colonials as cannon fodder? I kind of felt that reading the book. Yeah,
as a New Zealand author, I think it's something you have to kind of put in there, and you have to be rude about Australians. It makes us all feel better. But I do think it's hard to know. I think the English have always had a perception of colonials, like any empire. We'll always feel the far-flung parts are country hicks and less sophisticated, and I think we probably were less sophisticated than some of the English, but
they liked our fighting spirit.
They liked our fighting spirit, and they liked the product of our lifestyle. So I can't remember the facts. I don't remember facts as well as I used to, but the average size of your British soldier coming in was inches shorter than your New Zealand and Australian, and they were very conscious of the fact that was the diet of the inner city, industrialised inner cities of the UK, as opposed to our agrarian, protein-heavy diets and these fine fighting soldiers that we produced.
Well, son comes back to New Zealand just as the Spanish flu hits, and he's this broken man. I mean, basically, he's got post-traumatic stress disorder. He can hardly talk. I mean, that must have been quite a dark thing to be writing about.
Yeah, I found it very disturbing. And in his record, his war record, we have it's listed what his symptoms were. But it's very stark. You've got elevated heart rate, shakes, all these sort of physical symptoms that on their own seem very not benign, but for me they would just be the surface of a very tormented inner life that he would have been having, and it's very similar. All trauma I view as the same, be it if you suffer a PTSD from childhood experiences or adult experiences or war or domestic violence. All trauma is, the effect on the body is the same. And the First World War was a very traumatic experience for these men, as is most warfare. So we call it PTSD now. They called it shell shock. And as you go back through historical wars, they all have a name for it. And I saw a little bit of the movie Troy the other day, and it has Brad Pitt as Achilles, and Oliver Stone, who loves making movies about war, depicts Achilles as someone that has a form of PTSD, and he's the great Greek soldier. But it's that idea that you can't go through an experience like that without trauma. Interestingly, they had to get back. Took a long time for the First World War. You had to be demobbed, and that could be months, and then you'd be months on a boat. And those boats were great places. That time was a great time because they were outside of society almost. They were just with themselves. It was just soldiers coming home, and there was an element where they could process some of that sort of trauma. There was a psychological space almost to come back with. And if you look at the way that the RSAs, which were next door today, were developed, those again were places that initially were places where it was just them, so that they would never use the term like safe space, but that's what this was. This was where they went. This is where they could talk about these traumas. If you look at modern wars, though, the boys, the soldiers, both men and women coming back from, say, Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam, were back within 24 hours with jet travel. And that travel from war to peace in such a short space of time is
like a time zone almost.
Yeah, exactly. And it must be a very discombobulating kind of experience to go so quickly.
A friend of Son's suggested that he come along to a rugby practice. What surprised me is he'd never played rugby up until this stage.
No, but he was a farm labourer. He would have worked every Saturday. He would have been out of town. It's that much harder. We see it as a much more. But yeah, he hadn't played, and so he played his first game in 1919, I think, and made the All Blacks in 21.
He must have been very good.
He was very good. There was an old type of rugby called dribbling, which they don't do now, which was the forwards would get the ball it would be on the deck, and they would sort of kick it, but they would move as a mass of humanity coming down. There was no way to stop it. And he was known as one of the great dribblers.
I was thinking that was something that happened in the club rooms afterwards.
Yeah, no, it was that exactly.
But he made the Southland team that won the Ranfurly Shield off Wellington.
Yep.
And in a very short time frame made the All Black team, which went on to become the Invincibles, hence the name.
Yes.
And he was a flanker. Is that correct?
And again, scrums were different then. When the All Blacks turned up, they I can never remember these things, but they either had a three-person front row or a two-person, and the English had something completely different. So there wasn't a prescribed way that you would have a scrum. So there was always arguments about the referee and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, so some was in the forwards. Yeah.
It's nice to know that some things never changed.
Yeah, no.
They went over to Australia to play Australia and lost, and the ship that they were on sunk on the way home. They nearly all died. Something I didn't realise about the Invincibles, we nearly never had them.
Yeah, they played really badly in Australia.
The media roasted them.
Absolutely
worst
All Black team ever. And
they obviously hadn't got to 2022.
No, but it's exactly right. Nothing ever changes, and it was the nice thing that I think it's in the book, but there's a complaint about the All Blacks from an English writer about doing the haka. And it's like, wow, they just recycle the same headlines year upon year.
So Invincible was not a term that the New Zealanders gave to them. It came from the English media.
English, or was it the Canadians? It was one. Yeah, they didn't pen themselves. They didn't. I think they liked it once they got hold of it. But yeah,
the Americans didn't like it very much because they
were the Olympic champions. Yeah, and they yes. There's a bit in there that might be. I can't remember if I made that up or whether that was based on fact. But yeah, they didn't pay the Americans either. Actually, I had a go at everybody, didn't I? Really.
Don't let the truth stand in the way of the story.
Exactly.
No, but the Americans used to call themselves the Invincibles.
They did, and they were the Olympic champions, and they hadn't been beat by then. I think I made that up though.
But you didn't make up the part about the Maori team members not being asked not to play.
No, I remember. No, I may have made that up. Did I? Genuinely, I wanted to go back and look through all my notes this week. I didn't get time, but I imagine they didn't have a game against the Americans, and that was a period where the Americans weren't doing mixed sports. So yeah,
there were some great names in that Invincible team. Once you started writing about the rugby team, you could have picked any one of those, from the Brownlee brothers.
There was, see, absolutely. So the Invincibles were, but if they'd gone on from their form from Australia where they'd been terrible, we wouldn't know those great names now. So they went on and played so well in Britain that the Brownlees, George Napier, Mark Nicholas, all these guys turned into great All Blacks because of what had occurred on the tour. It was I found the structure of the book really hard because it was taking a man's life that was 10 years, so 1914 to 1924, 25, and so much occurred in that 10 years. So he did 4 years at war, and then did an All Black tour, and then I didn't want to skip the middle section where he was tormented, and to show what I wanted to show was the narrative arc of being able to go from the redemptive part of the story. So for the tour, I was very conscious of not ending up writing a 300,000 word book that would never be able to be finished, and I wouldn't have finished it. So I had to pick out some of those All Blacks and focus on them rather than take the full 30 and tell all of their stories.
But they had no coach, no manager.
Had a manager, Mr. Deans, but no, but no All Black team had a coach then. So it was up to the captain would do their own trainings, and Mark Nicholas took the back, so he was a genius apparently. And yeah, they didn't travel with the incredible backroom staff you travelled now. I don't know if it made it into the book, but Colonel, he was a colonel then, but went on to be General Freiberg, was still a proud New Zealander living in London, and he was preparing to swim the Channel. And he had 2 masseuses on staff at the time to help him prepare to swim the Channel, and the All Blacks didn't have any. So they would arrive in a town, and they'd then have to go find a masseuse or a physio or something and pay them cash if they could. And he offered them one of his masseuses to travel with him. And they had to turn him down because it would infringe on the amateur status of the All Blacks on the tour.
It's something we also forget about too. These players were away from home for months on end. No money. No money,
no. And you had to be able to prove that your family wouldn't go without during the period. They weren't paid. They didn't have cash. They weren't given a per diem or anything. So a lot of the sources for am I allowed to tell like a 5-minute story?
Yes, please.
So to get home, the All Blacks went from the UK to Canada, across Canada and down to San Francisco and then across the Pacific. And as they went, they stopped off and they'd play a game, often against themselves. And some of the hardest games they had on the tour was an inter-squad game. One of them, broken legs and broken arms. And they stopped in it, I'm going to say Toronto, but and they dedicated a cup, and that cup is played for each year by the local high school first 15s. It's called the Invincible Cup. And there was a man played for it when he was a teenager, and something occurred in his life, and he stayed on at his high school, and he was an assistant coach and gear man. His name is Ian Stevenson. I had to check about this. And so I was at the Rugby Museum doing research up in Palmerston North, and I was going through their photo archive. So to build out some of the stories of Invincible, I'd find a photo. There's a photo of them standing outside a plane. So then I'd write a story about what it must have been to be like to go on a plane for the first time. And the director of the museum came in after I'd been there about 3 days, and he plonked down this box of C90 tapes. This is a couple of years ago. On the desk, I said, "Oh, what are these, Stephen?" And he said, "These are C9. These are interviews with the Invincibles from the mid-'80s." And I said, "Oh my God, it's amazing." And he said, "Yeah, we don't have any. These are the only copies." So this amazing Canadian had come over in the 80s and had door-knocked, because he played for the Invincible Cup for so long, he was really and he just door-knocked the 13 surviving Invincibles, just found them in the white pages, and gone and knocked on their door and said, "Can I interview you?" And usually he had a bottle with them. And so he wasn't a professional journalist. He wasn't a professional anything. He just would press record. And he recorded these tapes, went back to Canada. He died in, I can't remember when, but sort of 2016. And his brother was going through his things, and he found these tapes and sent them across to the Rugby Museum. And no one had ever really listened to them. And so the director said, you can listen to them. I said, well, who's got a tape player anymore? And he said, well, you take them, William, and get them digitized, and then send us back the digital copies. And that's how that'll be why you get access. I don't genuinely feel like an adult most of my times to be trusted with actual history that I had to, and so I couldn't find anywhere in Palmerston North to do this. And so I drove down to Wellington to catch the ferry, and they were buckled into the front seat. And then on the ferry, I kept checking to see if I could see anyone getting into my car, and then spent about a month on the internet trying to find a machine that would do this, and I couldn't find anything. So finally, at my wit's end, I go down to the local internet cafe in Nelson, and I see up on the board it says transfers of slides to video, and said, you don't happen to transfer C90s? And the lady just says, oh, of course I can. And I said, these are really important. You can't muck this up, and anything happens. And she says, it's fine.
Trust me.
I do all this all the time. So finally got these digital, and there are hours upon hours of these All Blacks at an age where they've given up caring whether they're going to offend anybody. So they tell all the stories that they weren't supposed to tell.
Like the story of the media person who sleeps with someone and she gets pregnant, but he uses the name of another member of the rugby team.
Now, so the bit about that story that's true, the bit about that I made up, there's a split down the middle. So there is the fight that occurs on the boat home is true. So and that he was using his name. I made the bit about the pregnant bit. But
it's quite a good bit, though.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I had to embellish it well. But there's a bit on the National Archives, Sound and Vision Archives, of a 1954 reunion the Invincibles have, and I watched it. And the manager standing up and going, "We will tell." He's telling the boys because he knows the cameras are there. We'll tell all those stories later. We won't tell those stories now. We'll tell those stories later. So that adage of what goes on tour stays on tour, they were very protective. And so these tapes are a peek behind these walls of, and they had, and they were there for endless months. And every day they would have two commercial kind of, the same as the All Blacks now. So they'd visit a factory, a shoe factory, a cigarette factory, all these celebrity type things. But they had no money, so they'd be given shoes at the factory, and then they'd sell the shoes to buy some money for booze, or they'd get into fights, they'd have girlfriends. It was just this amazing kind of, they talk about that when the train left London, there were 75 women waving them goodbye.
And 23 men. That's a good odds.
Yeah, most of them married. And
my name's Anna Smale. I'm a novelist. I published 2 books, most recently Bird Life, but I've been talking about The Chimes, my debut novel, today. The festival is amazing. I feel like it's the best kept secret of literary festivals in New Zealand. Just the warmth and generosity of the hospitality. I feel like as authors, we've been looked after so superbly, and it's just so collegial. You get just time to be with other writers, which is, absolutely brilliant. It's more intimate than many other festivals. It feels like you actually have direct access and you're part of a sort of a friendly crowd, sort of in a book group or something. It just, there's a sort of an immediacy here. And I think, just the generosity of the sponsorship as well. It feels warm, and it feels, like a family gathering.
And but they were, they didn't tell. So these tapes, they're not very
priceless.
Good. I know, that's what I was really worried about, that I would be in control of the charge of them. But it was lovely stories. And Cliff Porter, the captain, they're so good. So he's obviously, they have a session, this Ian and Cliff. And, you've got Cliff still telling his story as he's urinating, obviously, and the little, it's just priceless. He felt slightly aggrieved by the rugby union by that point in his life. He didn't seem to be invited to test matches or So the tone of the Invincibles is coloured by his experience, and that's why I sort of paint the rugby union in the sort of way that it is in the book, because of these stories. But it's an amazing resource.
You talked about Lord Freyberg, and another interesting part was he actually opened up his home for dinner and invited the team there for dinner. And sitting opposite Son in the book is one of the generals, General Hamilton, I think it is, who actually sent the men up the cliff in Gallipoli, and the hatred that Son feels for this general sitting there. Now, obviously that's fiction, but I'm sure that sort of event would have happened, that they would have been at a dinner.
No, that dinner occurred. So,
and it was General Hamilton.
Yeah. And so, Owen, who gave me the story about Son, he wanted that to be, we discussed it, that he thought this would be an amazing event. And it could, you could tell that story, you could tell Son's story and have that, as a finale, where Son tells this general, all he's been waiting to say about this. But as I worked through with in the character of Son and things, I got to a point where it's like, I don't think he'd say anything. It's so hard. As New Zealanders, I think we swallow our words more
reserved, aren't we?
And you wouldn't. You're at a dinner. It's a formal occasion. He's a pillar of British society. He's a guest. Those aren't things that New Zealanders tend to do.
French might be different.
Yeah, French. Or in the Middle East, they're much better at expressing that, but we don't. And so as I wrote that scene, it was that Son would be furious inside.
But also he was the captain at times for the team. He would never have wanted to embarrass his teammates.
So it was, just to have that, kind of moment. But the depiction of the war as futile doesn't start in 24. So those generals aren't thought of as bad as we see them now till later. So one of the things I did check up on Nick last week was that that kind of idea of the war as pointless and futile comes a lot out of the war poets, your Graves, Sassoon and things. And I was looking up, because I thought we were talking about PTSD, and those two write those amazing poetry which shows the war and to a certain extent the cultural it gives us our understanding of the war through their poetry, and it has really informed the cultural context of what the war has come to mean. That futile, the lions led by donkeys, that kind of idea. And they were both treated for PTSD, both of those, Sassoon and Graves, and they both. The treatment of PTSD or shell shock after the war was haphazard. There was no actual prescribed method to treat these people. The doctors would think you're a shirker, or you should just get over it, or, all the way to shock therapy or whatever it was. It depended on where you were sent and what that doctor believed at the time.
Alcohol was...
The self-medication was, the choice of most people, and most people wouldn't tell anyone they were suffering. The two poets ended up at a Scottish, I think it's Craigieburn is the name, a Scottish large country house or castle or something along those lines, run by a doctor. And what that doctor did was his solution to PTSD was to encourage the soldiers to write. And they had an in-house magazine called Hydra, which they would publish. And that's when both of those, of what we now know as, two of the three great war poets, wrote their first poetry, and they worked together, and one was the editor, and they'd work. And so what that came to mean for me was that our understanding of the war and our understanding of the experience came from two men that were suffering from PTSD and had been encouraged to write about it. Now, I can never remember which one, but one of them only wrote for a 6 to 8 week period whilst they were there, and produced this astonishing series of poems that stands the test of time for 100 years. But it was all during their treatment for PTSD. It was that outpouring of trauma and pain that informed that writing. And I just thought, but that didn't come to the consciousness of the public till later. So even when Son was sitting at this dinner, it wasn't yet known as
a disaster.
The loss of life was known, but it was still seen as worth it to a certain extent. It comes a bit later that we start to see the futile nature of it.
Well, we'll come to the second book. Now, this was, when I say the second book, this is actually your first book.
Yes.
Now, The Battle for the Messines Road. Now, you wrote this in 2014. This book took 5 years to write. That one's half the size of that. Took you 20. So I'm really intrigued on that one. And I love the story behind this. It's actually you and J.K.
Moloney, yeah.
J.K. Moloney, not J.K. Rowling, but
no,
J.K. Moloney.
Easier.
Now, tell me the story about this. Who is J.K. Moloney? And
J.K. Moloney is my grandfather.
Whom you never met.
Never met. He died in 1970. He was a proud Cantabrian, lived his life in Christchurch. A lawyer, barrister, worked the criminal courts, and sports administrator. So was president of Canterbury Rugby and the amateurists, and a raconteur and a
writer.
And when he died, unbeknown to anyone in the family, his war diaries were put up for auction by my grandmother, and they were bought by the Alexander Turnbull. But we didn't know. Well, I wasn't born and didn't care, but no one knew. And so reading war histories, my father and I would see quotes from J.K. Moloney, but never knew where these were coming from. And my father has since died, so the story I tell, which is different to the one he tells, is now going to be the truth, which is nice. So I was studying for School C at the National Library, mostly because it was near to Wellington Girls College, and I typed Moloney into the internal search engine because I wasn't really studying, and this came up, and it was 120,000 word document, and it was his First World War diaries. We didn't know about it, and so I forgot about it. And then my father, when he retired, went and photocopied it, and he sent a copy to each. I've got 3 siblings, each of us, and I read it, and it was like, it's a really interesting First World War diary. He's not particularly brave. He's not particularly. There's a Forrest Gump, which you mentioned, aspect to his experience of the First World War. And
he liked shrimps.
Yeah, he does. he spends some time with Rudyard Kipling. He sees Winston Churchill. He sees the King. There's all these experiences that are in and around the war, but not. And so why it took so long was I only had a photocopied copy, so I had to type his manuscript out before I could start work on anything else. So that took for ages. We were living in London. It was a busy life, and we had 3 small children, so I'd occasionally get a chance to do a page. And then I set about writing it in about, I think, 2012. I started, and what I wanted to do was I wanted people to read an actual First World War diary in their words, but because again, it's a proper historical document. It's not modified or changed by a historian.
Fiction in this one.
And then to do that, to trick the reader, I wrapped the story of a boy growing up in 1968, Wellington, whose father's away at Vietnam, around the First World War diary, so I could have a play with that.
It's a great story. The boy does a paper run, and to get to his home every night, he runs through properties, and he gets caught by the daughter of this old man. And as a punishment, he has to read to the old man every night for 30 minutes. And it's supposed to be the paper, but the old man gets him to read his friend's journals. And the boy realizes very quickly that it's not the friend, it's the old man's, Mr. Moloney's journals. And so it's quite heart-rendering. And I think we're going to read a little bit here, because you actually said to me on the phone the other day that one of the things that you hoped from that book and also Invincible was to remove the myths around the Anzacs and also the All Blacks, because there's a lot of myths around them.
Yeah, yes. First thing, I'd never expect anyone to actually ever read a book I would write. So I feel a real freedom to have a go at things. And national myths, as we talked about, Gallipoli is one of them. Also the idea that these men that went away to the First World War or the Invincibles were Vestal Virgin type perfect humans, but they were rough and they were no different to us. And so
speak for yourself.
Yeah. But to put them on this pedestal makes it much harder for your current day soldiers or your current day All Blacks or whatever it is to live up to these lofty expectations that we build these up to. But as you mentioned, the Invincibles were chastised by the local press before they left as the worst All Blacks ever. But that period of time has changed them into
turned them into sort of
demigods, really. So yeah, I did not expect to read. So bear with me.
Some glasses.
I have got good light, actually. And an old soldier threw the first punch I saw, and a long-haired man collapsed to the ground. Then lots of old soldiers started throwing punches. I saw a flash of red, and an arc of what looked like paint hung briefly over the crowd. After a few moments, the long hairs started to run towards the cenotaph. Mr. Moloney was being carried along by the men towards the trouble. I jumped down from the lion, landing hard on the slick stone in my wet clothes. As soon as I was into the mass of men, I got held up. But I caught a glimpse of Mr. Moloney. I didn't know where his daughter was. Mr. Moloney! Mr. Moloney! He turned his head, then moved towards me, calling, Zach! I pushed on and kept calling. Finally, I got to him, grabbed him by the hand and said, Mr. Moloney, hi. Ah, Zach, good lad. We stood hand in hand while everyone moved around us. Where's Pamela? Over there. Caught up in the crowd. She all right? Yeah, she's fine. We need to get to her. I put his hand on my arm like I'd seen his daughter do, but he had to reach down, tilting him off balance. We headed in the same direction as the men, towards his daughter. All I could see now were the backs of the old soldiers. Suddenly, from the side, came a whole bunch of long hairs, pushing to get to the cenotaph. One of them carried a big red can. Oh no, you bloody don't! A soldier shouted, grabbing the man carrying the paint, spinning him round. He shouted, murderers, as he swung in his arms. Red paint flew in the wide circle. It sailed over me, coating Mr. Moloney's right side. His arm, his shoulder, and across his chest. His face was covered in little red spots like he'd been bitten by 1,000 sandflies. A bright red anger came up fast. I dropped Mr. Moloney's arm and rushed to the long hair. I drove my shoulder into his thigh just above the knee. I folded him. He folded forward and hit the ground. I jumped up and landed my knees on his back. All I wanted was to hurt him, and I started punching. My left and right hand attacking behind each ear, every punch hurting my hand. But I kept going. Left, right. I couldn't stop. So that occurs at a Anzac Day parade in Wellington. And so the long hair are the anti-war protesters. And that's a 10-year-old boy getting caught up in the melee.
And his father is actually
away at Vietnam, yeah.
So he's feeling very vulnerable.
Yeah, he doesn't really know what to do. And I wanted to write about a service family because we now, as we discussed that, we now view the Vietnam protesters as right, as correct, as the right thing to do. But in that context, we never didn't think about what it was to be both a serviceman or part of that family that was having to hear that your father figure was a baby killer.
The Vietnam vets never got the respect or placed on the pedestal that World War I and World War II vets.
No, and that's exactly so that Mr. Moloney's constantly, they're talking about the difference in this book about a good war and a bad war. For the soldiers, there's no difference. The war is the same experience, whether you're in First World War or Vietnam, but it's the cultural context and the politics that we place around it. So I think this book talks about that in the First World War, if you didn't go there was a white feather. And so the white feathers would be pinned on you as a coward. But if by Vietnam, if you didn't go, you were seen as a hero. And that why I placed it in 1968, because it was exactly 50 years from the end of the First World War. We were suffering that in 1968. And there was another 50 years to get to us to 2018, when I was sort of thinking about where the book might eventually come out. And it's how quickly we'd moved between those 2 points, how the world of 1918 was so different to 68 and then so different to us now. But that idea of good war, bad war, who's a coward here, is the brave person there, I thought was really interesting.
And the thing about Anzac, which you point out, or Mr. Moloney points out to Zach in the book, is that we think of Anzac, Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, but there were a lot of other nationalities in there. They weren't all New Zealanders or Australians.
No, but that's, as a product of our colonialisation, these people came here and then they quickly joined up and left again often, and they weren't necessarily what we would see as New Zealanders now.
I think Jane's grandfather came from Scotland.
Yes, yeah. She said, and he left again when he left again when he was 19. So it's again, it's that what happens to our vision of the group as the 100 years or a bit over 100 years now. We look back, we see them as this epitome of all that's best in New Zealand, or Australians certainly do. But they were a ragtag mixture, just like we are today.
Now, this book you had a publisher for this one, but you self-published Invincible. Why is that?
No publisher would publish it. It's very long. I keep mentioning how long it is, but it's
worth it.
They all rejected it. Would be the first reason. The one that was nicest about it said that I'd run into a bit of a COVID issue, in the sense that during lockdown, a lot of people who had never written a book suddenly
decided,
and so there was a lot of good books around there. But I
mean, I think it's an important book. I've 4 boys and I want all of them to read it, because I read it over Anzac weekend, actually. And I just feel it's a really important story that shouldn't be lost.
That's very kind of you. It will be lost, but
you can pay me later.
Yeah, it's very kind of you. But as I said, I'm always surprised. But people who read it seem to enjoy it, and that makes me very happy. But I think you're going too far to say it's an important book. It's a book.
Have you got something else online?
I have a couple of ideas. I've started a couple. I'm managing the Nelson College First 15, and it seems for a volunteer position take up a lot of time and a lot of my thoughts. You know that they're our
nemesis, don't you?
I know.
Marlborough Boys College.
We were coming up yesterday from Christchurch on the bus, and Marlborough had beaten Christchurch Boys yesterday afternoon, which was very good.
We'd love to hear.
Yes, but Christchurch Boys was holding some cup called the Trust Bank Cup. It's a knockout cup, and we now can't get it off you till next year. So our boys were all pissed off as all buggery.
But they did win.
They did, yeah. They were big. That was a great win. So it was, and it's a great competition. And I really enjoy First 15 rugby. It's We
actually have a former First 15 coach here in the audience today, Pete. So you've probably faced each other off.
No, as the manager, I'm mostly just filling water bottles and, doing
there's more and more Forrest
organising
Gump
pizzas.
Stuff coming in here.
So, but that's taking up a lot of my time. I haven't found the time to write at the moment, but I have a couple of ideas of what I'd like to do.
Well, look, we've got a few minutes before the end of the session, so if anybody's got any questions, please just hold up your hand. We've got a microphone here for you. Anybody like to ask? Pete, I'm sure you've got... Oh, no, here we go.
How did the Invincibles then manage? I mean, who paid for the ships? Who paid for the hotels?
So that sort of thing. All that was paid for. The rugby union paid for that. They just didn't give them any money. So they didn't get a daily allowance. Didn't get and didn't get paid. So if you were a farmer, it's manageable to a certain extent. You're away, but hopefully there's someone in the district, or you've got some brothers or something to look after the farm.
That's probably why we had so many farming members of the All Blacks over the years.
But if you were,
A lawyer.
would probably be all right. Bert Cook, who was one of the best on the tour, was jobbing kind of haberdashery, and he wasn't particular, and so his family would have really suffered. But also, you're away for 4 months with no income, and you've got no money in your pocket, so you had to buy around. You had to find a way to take someone out for a meal or whatever it was. So it was, and that's what's sort of forgotten about the amateur days, that the amateur days of rugby, we all used to cheat. So suddenly, Bert Cook, I think, played for a number of provinces, and the reason he played for a number of provinces was provinces would arrange him a job, and that job would be well paid, and it would probably be unexpected to turn up very often. So there was fudges along the way, yeah.
Steve.
Thanks for the story, William. Very enjoyable. I, like you, am a services brat, and I knew my way around Trentham military camp very, very well many years ago. The name Malone, and in reading your book, Invincible, Malone was a captain at Gallipoli, as I recall.
Yep.
Is that a family?
No, I'm a Moloney. So he's our most famous, probably a First World War colonel. He's from New Plymouth. He was in the Wellingtons and Chinook Bear. And one of the reasons I think Malone is so famous is he was incredibly articulate and had a lovely series of letters between him and his wife. So if you go to the Gallipoli exhibition at Te Papa, which is he's got his own little element where there's between him and it was 5 years ago, a really good book came out on him. So he was a much older man when he went. So he was 40s and 50s and had been settled bush blocks in New Plymouth. So yeah, but no relation. I don't know whether my father named me after him with the William bit, but no.
William, thanks for the insights. Wonderful. Just a big part of the book and son's return to New Zealand is his relationship with his mother, obviously. Did you manage to talk to any family members?
No. And again, as I said, I never really expected it to go anywhere. So didn't. Owen, as I said, had spoken to the families and had, I don't know if they've read it, but it was because it's historical fiction and because it's so long ago, I felt there was a certain license I could have.
What happened to him?
He lived a life. So he died, and I think he was a stock and station agent in Christchurch, and went on to have a,
Did he have a family?
Yep, I think so. So, because I was interested in that really intense period of his life, and I think for veterans, certainly the First World War, that's that sort of odd thing that they have to come to terms with, was that they spend 2 or 3 or 4 years, say if we take the First World War, of the most intense living you can do, right on the edge of survival at all times. You're dependent on your friends for your survival. You don't necessarily know where your next meal is. It's life at its most extreme. And then you come home and you go into a very normal life for the next 50 years possibly. And that's, with the first book, why I have Mr. Moloney, or the old man, revisit that period of his life, because that was the most exciting. Everything else was just every day.
Pales in comparison.
Whether, pale, but it's probably painted in slightly more muted colours. It's and having a family and a loving wife, if you're lucky enough, and all these things are great. But there were these years where they were absolutely, and I think, as you mentioned, whether that's a line in Caisson by Jimmy Barnes, but that was exactly where they were at. They were at their most bright there. And Invincible, I talk about Sun being, when he comes back from the tour, that he's high summer. And this is exactly that they're absolutely height of their powers at this point. But I think Son went on to have just a good New Zealand life.
Is there any other questions? Yes.
Hi. I read somewhere, and I'm not sure if it was in your book or if it was somewhere else, that the teams they played in Europe were quite affected by the loss of men in the war. And I wondered, were they that great, or were they just playing teams that didn't have very good players? Because
Now you're destroying our...
Sorry.
That is an excellent question. When you go through the ages of the Invincibles, there's a really distinct group. Two distinct groups, You've got veterans, and there was about 7 or 8. And then you've got really young people. And there's a sort of a missing generation from the Invincibles, as well as there would have been from overseas. So that's 5 years after the war. George Napier, when he toured with the Invincibles, was 19. So he missed the war because he was only, if it's 5 years, 14. But so there was a whole hole in across society, be it the All Blacks or be it the English team. But there was this younger generation that had just missed the war that, to a certain extent, I think at times felt that they had these things to live up to, because yes, those people had been lost in the war and they were no longer with us, but they were always sitting on mantelpieces. They were always perfect. They were always... So to grow up in a household and your older 2 brothers had died in the war must have been a hard thing to have to live up to, these ghosts that were perfect and would always be perfect. And
32 games, to win 32 games is phenomenal. Will we ever see a team like that again? I mean, we got to 16, I think.
Would we ever... I would love to see tours again and to play provincial teams. I've been forced onto Facebook by this First 15 stuff, and one of the ones I like is they have the historical NPC games, and they'll have like Bay of Plenty playing the Lions. And I saw an interview with John Leslie, a great Otago player, coach now, and he is talking about exactly that what a great thing to be able to go and play a touring team as a province. And that would be fantastic. So a lot of these, they're playing Gloucester, and the Invincibles are playing Gloucester, and they travel all over. They played Ulster, and on midweek, just going from place to place. And they toured to your point, they toured at a pretty good time. So in the sense that they weren't in the middle of the Northern Hemisphere season. So they got to a lot of these teams that were pretty good before they were really hitting their straps.
They beat the 1905 record because they beat Wales.
They did. They got very close to losing to England with Cyril Brownlee being sent off.
What was he sent off for?
Well, they like all good rugby teams, no one ever saw him do anything. So they swore that there was never an incident. I found a 1979 Truth article, if you remember the Truth, where George Napier had said, and it's in the book, that the referee thought that he'd been sworn at by Cyril in a game against Northamptonshire, and George said that he knew that the referee, who was the same one as the England game, was going to send Cyril off as payback for swearing.
My God, we'd have no All Blacks on the field.
No, you wouldn't.
No.
But that was in the Truth, and I don't know whether George had been paid for the article. So, as I say in Invincible, I think Cyril, I checked with the Rugby Museum, he was the third person ever sent off. There was a Romanian in the Olympics, anyway. But what used to happen was that he'd be marched off, and then the opposing captain would then remonstrate with like World Wrestling kind of, they'd go through this theatrics that the opposition captain would remonstrate with the referee that you wouldn't want to send him off, it's fine with us, and they'd bring him back. So it was a It's almost a pantomime. But surprisingly, for the dastardly English, the captain didn't do it. Didn't do it. So, he didn't do that. So, we lost a player. And I don't know if you remember, Sonny Bill Williams got sent off a while ago, and it was the same experience, I think, that he was suddenly this terrible person. And to be sent off as an All Black in 1924, Cyril's would have been terribly lambasted and his character called into question and all sorts of things. But I think because they won, it was sort of...
It was okay, forgotten.
It was forgotten to a certain extent. And the team all swore that they had... He didn't do anything. He was an angel.
One final question, if anybody's got one? No? Well, thank you, William. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much. And William, Invincible, I'm not sure about...
It's out there as well,
It is as well. Both books are out there in the foyer if you want to buy them. And William will be out there signing in just a few minutes. So I'd like to put your hands together, please, for William Moloney.
Thank you.
And please novel Nelson Boys High before you play Marlborough.
Yeah, well, okay? I'll give them a bad breakfast.
Yeah, good.
That was another great conversation from the 2023 Marlborough Book Festival. For more information about the event, head to marlboroughbookfest.co.nz. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes soon.